All right, welcome everybody to the Steel-Centered discussion. It's wonderful to have you all here, and we're grateful that Dr. Nathan DuFord is presenting today. Nathan's a professor of government at Smith College, and he's a social political philosopher, works on critical theory, inspired by the critical theory tradition, and feminist and queer thought. And his book, Solidarity and Conflict, which is right here, is an excellent text. I've not read all the way through, but wonderful and engaging. So please pick up this text. And also I'll announce it again. Nathan will be presenting tomorrow night in the Shell Theater, talking about domination and identity politics. So please put that on your calendars. At 7? Yeah. And Nathan will be talking about false equivalencies and political arguments. Let's give him a warm welcome today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited about our discussion. And so I'm just going to lay out some basic things before we do anything that is like interesting. So false equivalencies are a kind of informal fallacy. Sometimes they're called the fallacy of equivocation. And the way that they work is by drawing analogies that actually are disanalogous. So you have two things, someone claims they're alike in order to make a conclusion about one of them, but in fact they're not alike. Right? So this is one of the best ways to, you will experience this in your everyday life, right? So people will say things like, if people were chanting racist slogans at that protest, you definitely wouldn't support it then, as if to say you shouldn't support a protest which is not shouting racist slogans, right? So the effective thing that they're doing is saying, if things were different, you would act differently, except they're trying to say that things are not different. Right? That a protest at which racist slogans are being shouted is the same as one where they are not being shouted, right? This also comes in the form of a lot of free speech type stuff. So if you support any restrictions on free speech, then people will take that to the farthest extreme and be like, well, you must support all of these restrictions on free speech. Despite the fact that pretty much everyone thinks there should be some restrictions on free speech, even if it's like very minor and like in situations of emergency type restrictions. It's just a matter of figuring out where those go. Maybe the most famous example of this, I think, is John Stuart Mill's proof of utilitarianism, and I'm just gonna read this little section to you. The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. And so of the other sources of our experience. In like manner, I apprehend, the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. In the end which the utilitarian doctrine proposes to itself were not, in theory and in practice, acknowledged to be an end, nothing could ever convince any person that it was so. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. So, what Mill is doing here is using the word desire and desirable in two different senses in one sentence. So the sole evidence that it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people actually desire it. The first is desirable is a normative claim. This is something we ought to desire, right? That is different from people actually desiring something, right? And so there's a slippage between what people desire and what people should desire that are being equated. And that's how Mill gets the proof of utilitarianism off the ground. Another very common type of false equivalency that you'll see in political argument is through horseshoe theory, where you have the extreme left and the extreme right sort of coming down together and being closer to each other than they are to any other position on the political spectrum. So people will equate totalitarian communism with like National Socialism, for example, and be like, well, they're both sort of fascist totalitarian states. One is communist, one is socialist. These are effectively the same. And that only works if we look at both of those views at the most abstract level possible, right? We have to abstract away from all of the actual details that would make it clear they're not the same. So this is the, more recently, one of the cases in which this happened. This is the Students for Fair Admission v. Harvard case that just overturned the use of race in affirmative action in college admissions. And so this is written by John Roberts. He wrote the opinion on behalf of the majority. And I'll selectively read portions of it because there are a lot of weird citations in it. Eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. Accordingly, the court has held that the Equal Protection Clause applies, quote, without regard to any differences of color, or of race, of color, or of nationality. It is universal in its application. For the guarantee of equal protection cannot mean one thing when it is applied to one individual and something else when it is applied to a person of another color. So we have here the equivalency being drawn of excluding students on the basis of racial discrimination with working to include previously excluded students on the basis of racial discrimination, right? And so this is how we get white people are being discriminated against in college admissions, is to say, well, we shouldn't be singled out for our race either, which is what happens if you use race in admissions at all, right? So we're getting a kind of equivalence between writing a historical inequality and implementing a equal policy, but that is not equitable in some fashion, right? And then Roberts goes on to actually say this, which is very interesting. So respondents' admissions programs are infirm for a second reason as well. They require stereotyping, the very thing that Grutter forswore. When a university admits students on the basis of race, it engages in the offensive and demeaning assumption that students of a particular race, because of their race, think alike. Such stereotyping is contrary to the core purpose of the Equal Protections Clause. So first of all, it isn't obvious that what's happening in racial discrimination in affirmative action is that what they're trying to assume is that people of the same race think the same ways, right? And so what we get here is a false equivalence between race and like ideological positions that in fact was never the case, but we imply that it's the case and then we can argue against it, right? And the Supreme Court right now has been doing this a lot in a lot of decisions. They've been attributing things to entities which they haven't done or don't believe, and then ruling on the basis of the thing that they have imagined is happening, rather than the actual facts of the case. I could go on a lot about that, and I would stop myself. Historically, the way that this operated, a good example of it is the idea of special rights. So no special rights was part of a campaign against anti-discrimination laws for LGBT people. The idea was that if you had non-discrimination laws, you were giving queer people special rights that other people didn't have, because we don't have non-discrimination laws for other people, like straight people don't get them. And to the extent that they do, all people get them through the Equal Protections Clause, right? So this is sort of the argument that was made to undermine passing anti-discrimination laws or passing laws about the requirement for insurance to cover a domestic partner, or same-sex marriage was a very common place where you would hear, well, that's a special right that people want. And the way that same-sex marriage is a special right is actually very odd. And what it does is say, well, gay people already had the right to marry. They could get straight married just like everybody else. And it's like, well, that's not what gay marriage actually is. It's not just the gay people getting married is made equivalent to gay people having a gay marriage, right? Plenty of gay people throughout history have been married, and they were straight married, right? And so the only way that we can pump a claim of special rights out of this is to make an equivalence between two things that are very disanalogous, right? One is a marriage that someone doesn't want to be in, and one is a marriage that someone does want to be in, right? Sort of facially, anyone could understand that, but the same-sex marriage was considered like special because only gay people got it. We could use that logic to say, no, everyone has the right to gay marry now. Even straight people can get gay married, which is the logic that was meant to exclude gay marriage, but somehow we never, right, those who called it a special right never followed the logic through to the end, right? Okay, so right now, we're seeing lots of claims of special rights once again. So this was originally a very popular claim in like the 80s and 90s. Right now, similar types of claims are being made specifically about non-discrimination laws for trans people or bureaucratic processes created for trans people to become integrated into society in a smoother fashion, right? This happened most notably and visibly in the United Kingdom about the Gender Reform Act. So the Gender Reform Act in the UK set up a scheme by which trans people could have their birth certificate changed. In order to do that, trans people had to be on hormones for 2 years, had to pass a series of psychological examinations, effectively do a lot of therapy where a therapist would attest to the fact that yes, you are actually transgender, and had to have a doctor provide documentation that you are trans. So you have to get 3 different types of medical stuff set up in order to get what's called a gender recognition certificate, which changes the gender or sex on your birth certificate. Under those laws, only 17% of trans people in the UK had a gender recognition certificate, right? Which says that it's a very hard process to go through. right? Most trans people wait a long time before trying to change their birth certificate, but don't have the documentation of being trans for all of that time. Because in the United Kingdom, hormones are very difficult to get through formal medical processes. So most people do what they call DIY and just use gray market hormones. So often estrogen is bought from Russia or Ukraine, and testosterone usually comes from South America through like bodybuilding channels, which is like, just go to the gym and maybe you can find someone to give you hormones, because you can't find a doctor to do it. Now, in 2022, the UK was going to reform the Gender Recognition Act to implement what was being called self-ID, right? There's no more requirement that you be on hormones for a certain amount of time, or you live as that gender in a documented way for a certain amount of time. And there's no requirement that you receive certification from medical professionals that you are transgender, right? So effectively, you can change your birth certificate gender through your self-identification. I am this sex, put that on my birth certificate, right? This is not as simple quite as that. It was never going to be, but it was much simpler than the previous scheme of gender recognition. Then, I'm sure many of you are aware of the like massive amount of transphobia in the United Kingdom, and this was part of it, is that people started to argue against self-identification, right? So the claim was, well, we support trans people, we just support the real trans people, not the fake trans people who are trying to change their birth certificates without actually being trans, right? And so part of the reason that lots of people were so upset about this is because a gender recognition certificate gives you access to same-sex facilities. So if you are a trans woman, you have access to women's facilities because you are a woman. If you are a trans man, you have access to men's facilities because you are a man. And there were a couple of places where this was most strongly contested. Sport, hospitals, and like other medical provision type things, and like domestic violence, sexual abuse centers where you could go if you were being abused by your partner. And the claim with that one was, if you're being abused by your partner who has a penis, and there's a woman who has a penis in the house, that is re-traumatizing. And so we need to keep those women out because they're actually men who are sneaking in to harm vulnerable actual women. So what underlies a lot of their complaints is that trans people are looking for a special right that cis people don't have, which is the right to use opposite sex facilities, right? So in the mind of the critic of the reformation of the GRA, what is happening is it's providing trans people with a special ability to do something that cis people don't get. That's not what it does, right? It provides trans people with the exact equal opportunity that cis people do get, which is to use facilities that match their sex and gender. In order to make it seem different, though, they will say things like, well, what if a man identifies as a woman just to get on a women's sports team and beat everyone else, right? And so this is a kind of trick that people are playing, which creates this weird equivalency between people with malintent, a lot of which happens around like bathroom stuff, right? Someone with malintent could claim to be a woman and go into the women's bathroom and hurt women, with just trans people existing in a society, right? And so what underlies all of these sort of special rights claims is a false equivalency between equal rights and their violation, which you would think is hard to equivocate on, but that's exactly how these things work. So to say that gay people are getting a special right to get gay married, what you're doing is making it seem as though gay marriage is a violation of the equal protections of straight people, right? Because they're not getting a special right. And so it becomes what people will call reverse discrimination, right? And so this allows us to maintain the status quo of discrimination that's already in place. Because now, anytime we try to protect a group from discrimination, we're actually giving them something special that not everyone else gets, and that's the wrong thing to do. Here's another example that is sort of related to the previous one of a series of false equivalencies that create or maintain discrimination. So Anita Bryant in the 80s started a Save the Children campaign, which was intended to be a campaign against a Dade County, Florida law, like in Miami, effectively, that was a law that it was anti-discrimination law in like housing, education, like basic public access is usually what that's referred to as. And there was a campaign to repeal that law because the law created a danger for children. So by allowing queer people to exist in public unimpeded, that was discriminating against children by making things unsafe for them. We're creating places children can't go by creating more extra places that gay people can go. And this operates through like a series of equivalencies. So it equates public sexuality with public sex. This is what's at root of all of the like don't say gay bills in schools, is that being homosexual is itself a sexual act in public, right? And that's why we can't have people talking about how they're gay, we can't have people talking about how they're trans, because just to make the identification is to call up public sexuality. Another way that this happens, so right now, people are using the term groomer or grooming. Historically, it was child molester and then pedophile before it was groomer. All of these are ways of equating queerness with sexual danger, right? And what it actually is doing is, you know, the people who do this do think of queerness as a sexual danger, but it's not a danger against children, it's a danger against them, right? They have anxiety when faced with public queer people, and then project that anxiety onto children. And be like, these kids are scared because there are drag queens at the library, right? in order for that to function, you need to also have the drag queen as an actual danger to the kids, right? And so we do that by positioning them through this kind of pipeline of gay men are child molesters because of the history of pederasty in the Western world. And they're child molesters because they're pedophiles. They actually are only attracted to young boys because there's such a strong youth culture in gay communities. And so what they will do is groom your children into being gay so that they can have sex with your children. And so what we're doing here is following this like weird equation of being publicly queer with always doing sex in public, right? And of course we need to save the children from all of this public sex because we all know it's inappropriate for children to witness sex. As an aside, that's a historically recent phenomenon. People would live in single room homes with the entire family in the home. And so children would be present. They might even be in the bed with parents when they had sex. And so our contemporary understanding of what kind of sexuality is and isn't appropriate for children is sort of historically contingent. It's not obvious that even if children saw people actually having sex in public, that would be damaging. We simply have no way of knowing. You couldn't ethically do the test. You couldn't be like to the IRB, like, yeah, I want to show a bunch of 5-year-olds kink at Pride, and then another group of 5-year-olds not kink at Pride. We'll take them to the family-friendly Pride, and then in 10 years, we'll study them to see which one of them are like leather men now. That's not getting past the IRB. The other kind of like contemporary protecting women and children thing that has sort of fallen out of public consciousness is the QAnon sex trafficking cult stuff. And the way that operates is that it creates an equivalence between prostitution, all prostitution, and sex trafficking. So all prostitution is forced prostitution, regardless of whether the sex worker wants to be doing it or not. And they have ways of trying to make them the same. They'll say, well, sex workers are coerced by the circumstances of society into this job, and so they can't actually want to do the job. They've convinced themselves they want to because they have to, right? Never mind that this is how all jobs work. None of us want to be doing jobs. We have to do jobs because we need money. Like, as much fun as this is, I would like to watch Real Housewives. Like, we could all do that, and it would be great. And so this is another way that sort of protecting women and children rhetoric gets off the ground and gets support that actually doesn't rely on anything real, right? Okay. And so the way that this operates is that all of these false equivalencies exist in order to make it hard to make normative political judgments, right? We can go all the way back to what kind of civil disobedience will we support. If we call throwing soup on a painting violent, now we're making an equivalence between throwing soup on a painting and assassinating an oil baron. Those are both violent forms of protest now, right? And that's intended to muddle the judgment about whether one form is an acceptable kind and one form is not an acceptable kind. You will find some people who will bite this muddled bullet and be like, yeah, you should assassinate an oil baron. But that's going to be rare, mostly because you want people to be on your side. And when you start proposing political assassinations, not a lot of people want to join your cause. The ones who do are really into it, though. And so there's like, very dedicated 3 people, as opposed to like a mass of students in an entire city, right? And the reason that the kinds of false equivalencies that I'm talking about work rhetorically is that they create or reinforce public anxieties about something that is an actual danger, but it misplaces the source of the danger, right? In the wake of, there was a scandal, Jesus. There was a circumstance where the Boy Scouts of America had a lot of sexual abuse occurring within it. And like even the way that we talk about systemic child sexual abuse as a scandal is a kind of weird false equivalence. Like this is not a scandal. Like a scandal is like someone's top fell open while they were giving a talk, not thousands of boys have been systematically abused. In the wake of the discovery of that, we got a lot of anxiety about child molestation. That was reasonable because we had this mass of children who had in fact been abused. The result of that anxiety was stranger danger campaigns. In fact, the exact opposite of what had occurred was being warned against, right? And so we have this anxiety that exists, but we can inflame it and make it sustained through different means, right? Now we're all scared of strangers because we've equated strangers with danger. It's literally called stranger danger. When the danger is actually people's relatives, close friends of the family. Most sexual abuse, for most people in fact, will be done by someone you already know. And so we actually move the target of what we should be paying attention to something that does not cause a significant problem. And the way that once we've got sort of these moral panics going on, right, stranger danger, don't ever talk to a stranger, don't get into a stranger's car with a puppy, etc. One of the things that does is it reinforces the sort of status quo of dominative norms that are in place, right? So once we have all this anxiety about stranger danger, whenever there's like a gay man around children, he's the stranger danger, right? This has shifted now that gay men are capable of being publicly gay around children in an acceptable fashion to groomer, right? Now we're actually concerned about the way that child sexual abuse does occur, but we are not concerned with the people who actually do it, but instead this other group who is historically dominated, and we're going to keep dominating them on that basis, right? Do I have another slide? No, I don't. Okay, that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Questions or comments, discussion? Raise your hands.
I have a question. I'm not a theorist, but I have I find your story, and by story I mean logical narrative that you were laying out. Compelling, in particular because I lean in a direction that confirms, like politically lean in a direction that is confirmed by the stories you're laying out here. So help me understand then the ways in which, two things. One, Paulo Freire's idea of, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here, Paulo Freire's idea of like a lack of education being state-sanctioned violence against people, and therefore saying, in fact, education should be available to all, plays out. And then the second thing would be so many posts that I saw, so many social media posts that I saw during the last election, which were, if you vote for this candidate, it is violence against me. So can you walk me through the logic, at least of the second?
Yeah.
And help me understand the ways in which this does fall under the political arguments that you're talking about and the ways in which it is substantively different.
Good. So, the voting being violence against me is actually, I think, a clear example of how this does function.
Okay.
So there was, during the last election, a ton of public anxiety about who would be elected, right? So we already have this circumstance in which there are identifiable harms that have occurred and are continuing to occur, and something that is loosely connected to those harms, right? In the form of equating the harm with the vote, right? A vote is not a violence, unless we want to say that lots and lots of things are violence, insofar as they are causally connected to a harm, right? And so what we're ending up with is this kind of equivalence of any harm with violence, and like an intentional kind of violence, right? Even where it isn't violence, right? If I live in Mississippi and I vote for Donald Trump, it's not obvious that that actually does anything. Mississippi's votes were always going to go to Donald Trump. And so there's a sense in which it's entirely possible that the vote means nothing. Because if you voted for Biden, it also wasn't going to have any effect on what occurred, right? This only works on an individual level, though. Because if enough people change their votes, then it will have a substantive effect, right? But the one vote on its own, being equated to violence, is meant to create a kind of panic and urgency to vote, because the other kind of voting is violence, and you don't want to do violence, and so now it's very urgent that you vote in this particular way. A lot of these kinds of like inflamed claims of violence have at their basis a real anxiety, right? Like the person who will be harmed by Trump's presidency is not lying that there will be violence enacted upon them in the form of state violence, which in fact is the kind of violence that we pretty much never recognize as violence, right? When a protest is violent, it's because protesters are doing violence, not because cops are there with guns and batons. And so we have this kind of inversion of where violence originates in political violence that happens there. Most political violence comes from the state, not from individual actors. Not even individual actors on behalf of the state either, right? Like, there are a lot of people involved in coordinating the violence of the state, and such that you couldn't identify just one who's doing it. And so Does that answer your question? Does that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't have questions about how many degrees removed and whatnot, which are a different conversation, but, that's helpful because I remember seeing the post and thinking to myself, this does not feel right, but also I'm not quite sure why it's wrong, because it's not wrong, and I can see the logic. So I was curious about your.
Yeah, so it actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it makes me think of like Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin's arguments against pornography, right? That pornography doesn't cause violence against women, it is violence against women, right? Which relies on an idea of ideological violence equated to a physical violence that just doesn't actually cohere in reality. Like in reality, people who watch very violent porn don't keep watching very violent porn for very long. They eventually like start watching even more plain porn than the average porn consumer. Yeah, very strange, unexpected. I actually thought she was right about that one, where it was like, oh no, of course they would look for more. But it's the same kind of twist.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, I guess, do you have any like writings or any ideas on how we like kind of shift the narrative or start to bring more awareness to these false equivocations?
I mean, I think that identifying them is important, because the thing about the false equivalencies is that they will attract support from people who consider themselves just like, I'm politically reasonable, right? People who are opposed to whatever is trying to be accomplished with the equivalency will probably always be opposed to it and try to identify the logic of what's going wrong in the rhetoric. But where it works is this like persuadable middle who think of themselves as being very rational and not like emotionally moved by rhetoric, when in fact they're just being moved by rhetoric differently. And so if I had to make like a positive suggestion, it would be to sort of identify where that happens publicly for people, right? A lot of that happens publicly for people right now in television shows, right? Like MSNBC, CNN will have on people who make these false equivalencies and won't challenge them and be like, oh, hey, maybe this is actually disanalogous, right? And it happens through just media in general. So like the New York Times does this all the time. And both political parties do it all the time, right? Like the idea that the Affordable Care Act created death panels, right, is a kind of version of this, right? And so you can point out that the logic is going wrong, but how persuasive that is to people is unclear. Tactically, I'm tempted to say, just use false equivalencies for your own ends, right? Like, why be hamstrung by rhetorical structures that your opponent refuses to be hamstrung by? Like, we're just hamstringing ourselves based on some idea that like, oh, well, like, I'm normatively better because I'm talking about the facts. And it's like, well, no one cares about the facts. The facts are not going to save you. People are persuaded by this type of reasoning. So persuade them with it. Which is like kind of it's like a very realpolitik way of thinking about it.
Bergen, go ahead.
Do you think how you're describing kind of like makes me think of neoliberalists. And so my question is like, I'm thinking about Dr. Shank's example too, like neoliberalism and that it like emphasizes individual impact. Do you think that propagates false equivalencies?
I'm tempted to not answer your question and answer a question you didn't ask, which is that neoliberalism itself is based on false equivalences, right? So you're like, yeah, do that one. The thing that neoliberalism needs to get off the ground is individualism, right? And so in order to get that off the ground, it has to be against any form of communal or group structured political programs, right? And so when neoliberalism was actually like in its early phases, we were coming out of World War II. And the reason it became an alternative is because it was an alternative to the communalism of National Socialism and the communalism of communism, right? And so it was an attempt to chart the course out of these two forms of communal government that it equated with each other, right? And so we actually just get a form of political structure that can't have any communalism involved, because when we do that, we're actually Nazis, right? And so I don't know if it creates more of them, but I do think it is based on them. Sorry, I didn't answer your actual question.
Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was trying to think, a lot of, I mean, the title there sums it up nicely. Sorry that I'm going to try and think about like an ideal speech type situation, as in like Habermasian way.
Yeah.
But I understand the reason why one would employ particular rhetorical strategies to, win in a political context.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, if we are in that ideal free speech situation, if we're trying to sort of have critical reflexivity. A lot of the examples of false equivalences seem to be ones that conservatives make against, apologies for the simplification, but against left-wing commentators. If we're trying to be self-critical, what are the ones, and I think we were talking about it a bit, but more sort of explicitly, which are the ones that left-wing arguments rely on and traps people tend to fall into regarding making claims that actually may not actually stand up to interrogation, or I think you had it with the you changing your mind maybe on the Catherine McKinnon pornography issues. What are those false equivalences that are contemporary and relevant maybe? Are there ever ones that are really salient that will probably stand out? And then also, how can we be alert and aware to them? Can we just apply reason and logic to interrogate, have certain empirical claims, or is that just adopting the master's tools, right? But yeah, really simple question, so long comment, but simple question is, what is it on the left wing that left-wing analysis use, which tend to employ false equivalences that spring to mind?
Yeah, so the sex work example is a leftist example, right? There is a lot of left-wing opposition to sex work because it is equated to forced sex work. The pornography example that I gave is another one. You also got it a lot during both elections in 16 and 20, with Democrats calling Trump Hitler, or like putting out like propaganda images where Trump would have like a Hitler mustache, or would be doing a salute of some kind, or wearing a hat, or like hanging out with Putin, right? And so the goal of those actually is to say, like, Trump is Hitler, and Trump is not Hitler, right? There are significant differences between what the two were up to, And so that was a big one for a long time. I'm like cooking up one about immigration, but I can't put all of the dots together. Because I know that leftists do this over immigration, and I can't think of a good example for you. Yeah, I can't think of a good example of it, but I like have in the back. In 3 hours, I'll think of the example.
Add a quick follow-up. Are there any like sort of warning signs when someone's making an argument and you go, this could be a false equivalent here? Is it they start to employ metaphors? Are there anything that sort of makes your alarm bells go off when someone is sort of making an argument where you think, this could be a false equivalent? Is there something that you'd warn us to be aware of?
Usually, I look for like verbal sleights of hand, where one concept subtly becomes another. So we were talking about sex work and now we're talking about sex trafficking. Or any kind of historical analogy is gonna get this cooking, right? Simply because almost no one knows anything about history. And so we can just make up stuff and it works. Because no one's around to be like, actually, that's not true, right? A friend of mine actually, he, in his classes this year, he works at a major research university. No student could correctly identify when the United States Civil War began and when it ended. Right? That's how poor historical literacy is in this country. And so historical analogies are where this happens a lot. Yeah. Also funny, I wrote my dissertation on Habermas. I was advised by a Habermasian, so.
So, I guess more question about intervention. Mm-hmm. You mentioned, like, when, in some contexts, saying like, this is a fallacy of equivocation, bro. That's not gonna work.
Yeah.
So, why does that not work, right? And then also you mentioned the attempt to turn it around or flip it upside down, right? And sometimes people who watch SNL, they get it. Other people don't get it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, why did they not get it? Why did they not get that it's actually undermining the kind of reasoning by flipping it around, making it extreme, right? So like, when the tactics of engaging with this don't work, why do they not work? And then like, can you like get it to work somehow? Can people be convinced that fallacies are significant, right?
Yeah.
Not to do.
I mean,
you know what I mean?
I will tell you a secret,
Yeah.
which is not going to be a secret anymore. But when I used to teach logic, I intentionally would not really teach informal fallacies because then students are not actually engaging with substance of arguments. They're just like looking for these little problems, right? That actually aren't always problems. An appeal to authority is not always fallacious. If you're like, yeah, my doctor said I had cancer, and someone's like, well, you're appealing to an authority, maybe you don't have cancer, and it's like, well, I have to appeal to an authority for this one. There's no other cancer finder, right? And I think that that's because just talking about the formal structure doesn't show us what the like political stakes of the structure are, right? And this is also, I think, the SNL problem, is the problem of like parody as political critique. There will always be people who think this is good, actually, right? Like, there are people who identify with villains on television and in movies and don't realize that's the bad guy.
Yep.
And then are very upset to learn, oh my God, you think he's the bad guy? Like, no, he's not the bad guy. And so any form of political argument that relies on the viewer to supply the critique is liable to fail in that exact way. It's like asking a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
You could always get the answer you don't want them to give. Because what we're actually doing is saying, you make the argument because I don't want to. Or because I can't, right? And so more direct forms are more clear in that, but they also might be less persuasive than the parodic, satirical forms would be, right? Because arguments are boring. Like, no one wants to feel like they're like in logic class when they're like talking about politics. Politics is already boring. And now we're just like making it a real snoozer.
How about definitions, like in the violence case, like defining what violence is? Is that like an okay strategy? If there is equivocation, it's really about meaning, so can we like re-articulate what we're doing by doing that? Or is that also like, you're just talking about semantics, right?
I think identifying that it's a contested ground is one of the best things that you can do there, right? Because you're not going to be able to give a definition of violence where everyone's like, yeah, that's it and nothing else. But identifying that there is contest over what counts as violence, and there are ideological reasons that we see some things as violence and not others. And sort of identifying that, I think, can help us think more complicatedly about it, at least. It might not change what anyone does or thinks, but it presents the opportunity. It also does the thing that it doesn't do the thing that I think fails in cases like this, which is like, in pointing out that the reasoning is fallacious, you're telling someone what they should think, right? And just identifying it as a zone of contest allows them to have agency, and that is like a place where actually they might change their mind.
Other questions, comments, ideas?
Yeah, does someone else want to solve this problem? I just came to point out the problem.
I have something.
Yeah, go
Or
ahead.
should we end it?
No, go. We got time.
In a class of mine, we've been thinking about like self-defense, and I feel like that could be really applicable here.
Yeah. It's, in what context have you been talking about it?
I was just gonna say, this reminds me of the Judith Butler. Go on.
You.
No, you.
No one wants to
Let me
be
ask you a
responsible for
rhetorical-
explaining
Let me ask you a
Butler.
rhetorical question. Go ahead.
Well, in my race and class
That you led and provided material for.
that I led and provided material for, I like provided a lecture on that Judith Butler did on legal violence,
Mm-hmm.
and like this idea of graveability, and in that she did a little discussion on that. But I want to hear more about what you think in terms of false equivalency.
May I argument, are you talking particularly about the expansion of self? Like, what is allowed to be self-defense? Like, you are allowed to exercise violence if it is certainly to defend yourself from bodily harm, but then also your child, and then where does that start? And at what point do you perceive someone else's existence as a threat to yourself that is proactive?
Thank you.
Does that help
Yes.
contextualize?
Yeah, so the circumstance that this makes me think of is the Black Panther Party, right? Which was the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Like, the idea of it was we will patrol our communities and we will keep us safe. And that came in the form of both like safety from vigilante violence, but also safety from state violence, right? Which is why like they considered free breakfast programs a form of self-defense, right? As a community, we've been systematically deprived of the means to even feed ourselves. The state won't do it. And so in order to defend our people, we have to feed them in order to make them safe. It also meant like walking on the California State House with machine guns, just to say like, yeah, try it. That's actually how California ended up with strict gun violence laws, was that a bunch of Black people were carrying very large weapons, right? But then you also have, right, deranged people who will kill someone just for knocking at their door, right? And it's like, well, I was scared. I was threatened. I needed to defend myself against an outside threat, right? And so all of it does depend on what is determined to be threatening.
Well, I was thinking in terms of like police violence too, and like arguments in court versus like whether violence is permissible or not.
Mm-hmm. So legally, self-defense also includes vulnerable, defenseless others, right? Which is why you can legally defend your children. Like if a maniac is trying to stab them, you can kill the maniac because your 3-year-old can't do it for themselves. And the determination of a defenseless, vulnerable other has like reasonability characteristics built in, which is how all of these things are determined, which is like, what would a reasonable person decide was reasonable in this circumstance, right? That's how we get a lot of defenses of police violence. A reasonable police officer in this exact situation would have good reason to shoot an unarmed person because they thought it wasn't an unarmed person and thought it was an armed person. And it's reasonable to defend yourself if you're facing an armed person. And so there's like a counterfactual thing that gets projected in order to make that kind of self-defense legal and reasonable. Well, legal because it's reasonable. This doesn't work, for example, for women who have been abused by men in their homes. A woman in Florida killed her husband, and because he was like really abusive. She had lots of documentation of his abuse. She killed him in their home to defend herself and tried to use Florida's King of the Castle law, which is like you can defend your home up to and including by killing someone for invading it and posing a danger to you. And it was found actually that she wasn't acting in self-defense because she wasn't defending herself in her home. She was just defending herself and happened to be in her home. And so we can, the law will find ways of pumping out status quo, even in cases where you might think, well, we could use this to our advantage. I don't know, does that answer your question? Yeah.
Well, let's thank Nathan for the discussion. Thanks everybody for coming.